You're welcome, everybody. This is Brendan Arrigan here, on a very special day. We'll just give it a minute or two to just let everybody who's joining in the conversation come in. We'll just give it a little bit more time now, just to allow people. It's just 1 o'clock now, so just about a minute. So I think we're good to go. Gíomh gach duine agus fáilte ar an lá seo, lá na surveyor ar fud an down, fiche ceathair. Hello, everyone. You're very welcome on this global day of the Surveyor 2024. It's my honor and a privilege to be here and the chair of this CPD today. I'm Brendan Arrigan, a fellow of the Society of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland. I'm a surveyor now for 46 years, starting my journey on the day I walked through the gates at the Phoenix Park to the Ordnance Survey Office in 1978 at the ripe young age of 18. I worked in the Ordnance Survey then for 20 years, and then I'm in independent private practice since then. But now it's not about me today. You'll be glad to hear that. The topic of the CPD today will be a peculiar survey for our peculiar purpose, founding the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. This CPD will explore the months immediately prior to the foundation of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland in the spring of 1824, 200 years ago. It aims to uncover the needs for the survey, spotlight individuals who shaped its inception, and shed light on the often passionate parliamentary debates regarding its methods. This, in turn, would leave a lasting imprint on the project's enduring legacy. In a few moments, I'll hand you over to Finian O'Keena. Finian is a qualified surveyor, so he knows plenty about surveying. He now specialises in GIS. He's also a historian with a PhD from Maynooth University in 2011. Into the bargain, he has written 3 books prior to this, and this is his 4th book that he'll be talking about today. Before I start, the running order will be that Finian will talk about the upcoming book in his presentation, and then there'll be a question and answer session. If you have any questions, just click on the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. The famous American historical author David McCullough once said, "History is an extension of life. It enlarges and intensifies our experience of being alive, like poetry, art, and music." So to elaborate on this and more, I'm going to introduce you to the man himself, Finian O'Keena. Over to you, Finian.
Thank you, Brendan, for a lovely introduction. And hello, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation, a peculiar survey for our peculiar purpose, the founding of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. My name's Finian O'Keena. I'm a graduate of Bolton Street's land surveying course, and I've recently written a book titled The Origin of Ireland's Ordnance Survey, which is very kindly sponsored by the SCSI, and will hopefully, fingers crossed, be out in June this year to celebrate the Ordnance Survey's bicentenary on this island. So we're going to learn an abridged version of it today. So if anyone's really interested in the topic, what we touch on, you'll find far more detail throughout the book. And just as a little warning, I do use a couple of AI images throughout the presentation, just for illustrative purposes. We're not talking Kate Middleton here. We're not talking people with 6 arms, but it's very rare to get images of land surveyors at work in that period. So just purely for illustration, just to show you what people wore and the conditions they were in. So I shall begin. We got a lot to go through, but I'll keep it pretty tight. So today, 21st of March 2024 is Global Surveyors Day. Chance to celebrate the contributions surveyors make in society and an opportunity to celebrate our professional heritage. Here in Ireland, we have a particularly rich history of surveying and mapping, usually tied directly to wider factors that have shaped life on this island. This year's Global Surveyors Day, in fact, coincides with a significant date in Irish surveying history and is one I would like to talk to you about. 200 years ago today, a group of 19th century politicians, military officers, and civil servants were about to begin planning for a new general survey of Ireland. Over the course of the work, the country's turbulent history with surveying and mapping would be exposed and a new cartographic course was set. The results of their efforts was the formation of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. The Ordnance Survey means different things to different people. As the official mapping agencies of the Republic and Northern Ireland, Táilta Éireann and the OSNI play a key role in strategic and day-to-day governance. Both originated from a single pre-partition entity formed in 1824. Over the intervening years, the work has permeated into much of society, ranging from education, outdoor activities, historical and cultural research, and even literature and theatre. While the significance of the Ordnance Survey has changed since its founding, much of its original character remains. And over the next 40 minutes or so, we will see what reasons led to its foundation, who had significant stakes in its mission, and how a previously British entity was fundamentally reshaped by the landscape and people of Ireland. It was a peculiar local survey which we required for our peculiar purpose. This was how Thomas Spring Rice reflected on the planning of the Ordnance Survey. As an MP, he played a pivotal role in shaping the scheme's earliest days. His use of the words peculiar in this case was very explicit, helping separate the Irish Survey's specific goals from the generalities of the older Ordnance Survey of Britain. The new survey was also peculiar from the perspective of Irish history, being very different from earlier punitive mapping schemes. Such peculiarity therefore made the survey distinct and in many ways more complex. Such distinctiveness became apparent while Spring Rice and others set out the survey's mission during the first 6 months of 1824. Not all was smooth sailing, however, as a dispute broke out within the British government over the survey's essence. Essentially, would it be a civilian or military scheme? The ordinance's enduring legacy lay in the outcome of this argument. So the whole story takes place over about 130 days between February and June 1824. Much of the dispute was due to one man's opinion, Dublin-born Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. A serving field marshal, the victor of Waterloo, an efficient administrator and military powerhouse, Wellington could also be vain, imperialistic, and was in all aspects of his life a noted micromanager. In early 1824, he was a prominent member of the British government as master of the Army's Board of Ordnance, including its small surveying department. At that time, Ireland was ruled from London following the Act of Union over 20 years before. While an administrative regime remained in Dublin, true power came from Westminster. In February, Wellington was approached by senior members of the Dublin Castle administration for his help in a problematic matter, land-based taxes. While this may seem like an unusual topic to approach a senior military officer with, Wellington had in fact the exact resources at his disposal to help. The most problematic of these taxes came in two forms: cess, county cess, and tithes, with each landholder responsible for their payment. Cess was used to pay for local services in each county, such as roads and bridges or administrative roles. Payments were based on the size and value of property per townland, with over 60,000 of these small and archaic divisions spread across the island. Tithes, by contrast, had a more discriminatory edge. They too were based on property, being valued at 1/10 of all agricultural output. Controversially, tithes were paid directly to the Church of Ireland, regardless of the religion of the landholder. As a result, they were highly resented by Catholics and minority Protestant faiths. One of the key issues with both taxes was the data they were based on. Many assessments were over a century old and often stemming from unknown sources. Over time, the output and therefore taxable value of lands had changed. though the charge to landholders remained the same. Consequently, some were excessively taxed while their immediate neighbours paid little or nothing. The result was a massive, clumsy partiality and injustice, which added to increasingly violent social tensions in post-Union rural Ireland. Officials in Dublin Castle were understandably eager for tax reform, hoping to reduce tensions and avoid the very real chance of rebellion or mass violence. It was in this context that they reached out to Wellington. Chief among his correspondents was his elder brother, Richard Wellesley, who was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. In an upfront letter, Wellesley brought Wellington up to speed with the ongoing saga of Irish taxation. As these tariffs were based on land, new accurate mapping would be needed for any re-evaluation, becoming a guide for valuers in the field and an official record of dues. Unfortunately, no such homogeneous island-wide survey existed. Opting to circumvent the Prime Minister, Wellesley instead reached out to his brother. The idea of an ordnance survey appealed greatly to Wellesley, as he had little faith in Irish expertise. By the 1820s, Ireland had in fact a highly developed surveying profession, though it lacked any official governing body. Surveying, in its modern concept, had been introduced during the Tudor conquests, 16th century thereabouts, and spent the following century and a half in the measurement of seized Catholic and Gaelic lands. In a violent cycle of rebellion, war, and defeat, the traditional economic and political assets of leading Irish families, that is, their lands, was removed, with English surveyors often exposing these areas to the outside world for the very first time through their maps. By the 18th century, this process had ceased, with all lands that could be seized having been taken by a new landed class known as the Protestant ascendancy. The Irish surveying profession, now mostly populated by Irish rather than English practitioners, switched its commercial focus to the needs of both landowners and their predominantly Catholic tenants. By the 1820s, Ireland was self-sufficient regards land measurement, with a vibrant property surveying scene and a capable though small group specialising in county-level surveys. By this stage, most of the island's counties had been individually mapped at scales ranging from 1 to 4 inches to a mile. This process was, however, conducted in an uncoordinated movement and to varying standards of accuracy. Overall, the profession was populated by several hundred individuals, some of which were merely part-time surveyors operating on individual estates or employed by neighbouring farmers. Others, however, were highly proficient, using the most accurate instruments available, producing high-quality printed maps, and were in communication with some of Europe's most famed cartographers. Such capabilities, however, did not impress Wellesley. He confided in Wellington that neither science, nor skill, nor diligence, nor discipline, nor integrity for such a survey can be found in Ireland. And just to note, Wellesley here was born on Merrion Street in Dublin, which is only about 600 metres from the Society's HQ. So pretty powerful stuff coming from him. By contrast, the Ordnance Department was ideal for the task, Wellesley stating that I am therefore satisfied that the only source from which the means of executing the survey can be derived is the ordnance, and that you, Wellington, are the only authority capable of infusing the spirit which such an operation would require into the agency which must be employed. To compose his response, Wellington turned to his resident expert, Major Thomas Colby. Colby was a driven, talented, and at times eccentric early 19th century man of science. He had dedicated the past 20 years of his life to making the most correct and accurate mapping possible on behalf of his nation, and was by 1824 the superintendent of the Ordnance Survey of Britain. He had initially joined their ranks in 1802, shortly after being commissioned in the Royal Engineers. The accidental loss of his left hand the following year did little to slow his efforts, with Colby being appointed superintendent in 1822, so about 2 years before the events we're going to study today. Aptly dubbed the dominant character in the Irish Ordnance Survey's early history, Colby's energy and vision gave the eventual project much of its distinctive character. Colby informed Wellington that a small team would be capable of conducting a similar style survey to that of Britain and Ireland, though he would need additional staff. With them in place, the survey could be completed as early as 1831. The first maps actually ended up being printed in 1833. Within a week, Wellington responded to his brother, assuring him that he supported the project, though it will be delayed owing to the want of persons properly trained. No survey will begin in 1824, but it will commence next year with such force as will enable us to complete the survey of the whole of Ireland in 5 or 6 years. The Board of Ordnance was now committed to involvement in Ireland. At this stage, it would be useful to briefly review the history of the Ordnance Survey of Britain up to 1824, helping place the Irish survey in context and highlight the different needs of both islands. To begin, the term Ordnance Survey was not originally a noun as it is today, representing an organization, but rather a verb, an action. It was the act of surveying land conducted by the Board of Ordnance, a military department, on behalf of the British government. Therefore, from the perspective of early 19th century officials, references were likely to be made to an Ordnance Survey rather than the Ordnance Survey. The Board of Ordnance was responsible for fortification and supply of ammunition to the British Army. The first of these roles invariably led to an understanding of terrain, helping identify and fortify strategic positions, with mapping being an integral part of this knowledge. And we can see this sort of long-term legacy with the Board of Ordnance still today. The image on the left you can see with the little highlight, that's a Board of Ordnance marker, and you can see the arrow fletching below. That fletching was placed on government property, so you'd find it on cannons, on ammunition boxes, on spoons, and that was transferred eventually when the Ordnance Survey got going in Britain to the benchmarks that we know today. So that long-term legacy is still there. This is a government marking. The Survey of Britain was born as a result of the Jacobite Rebellion in 1740 Scotland. In its wake, military surveyor William Roy was tasked with producing a standardized map series of the Highlands, doing much to improve the army surveying capabilities and exposing the heart of Jacobite Scotland. His efforts were well received, and he subsequently did much to promote high precision surveying in government circles. Such investment soon paid dividends as accurate mapping, governance, and the ideals of the Enlightenment became further integrated. Steps towards a medium-scale topographic map of Britain emerged in stages. One was the great triangulation between the Royal Observatory in Greenwich and its equivalent in Paris in the 1780s. Soon after, a series of isolated surveys of strategic locations along the English coast were ordered by the Board of Ordnance. Driven by threats emanating from revolutionary France, these surveys were soon linked up and eventually extended across southern England. This project was conducted by Roy's successor, William Mudge, and evolved over time. Most notably, the scale of the survey was reduced from 6 to 2 inches to a mile and was eventually published as a 1 inch to a mile series, beginning with a map of Kent in 1795. The little map you can see there of Britain, the shaded areas are places where the OS had produced mapping at the time of the events in this presentation. So 1824, you can see they've done all the south coast, the approach to the Thames, and in and around Bristol. So that obviously from a strategic position, that's most viable, that's most necessary. Pembrokeshire and Wales was chosen because that was the last place the French had ever successfully landed troops in Britain. So they weren't going to let their old enemy have the same advantage twice. And Lincolnshire skipped the queue due to pressure from local farmers and landowners who wanted to get their property surveyed as quick as they could. But we're going to revisit that again in a second. And the ghosts of Lincolnshire soon came to haunt Ireland. And we can actually see there the Kent survey, the first map produced. Despite its potential, the British survey remained, in the words of one geographer, a glorified military reconnaissance. Focus was based on topics of military interest, such as topography. Civil boundaries were limited to county level only, with the exception of Lincolnshire, where a local division known as 100 was included. Lincolnshire had also been the one area where the survey had supplemented its teams with civilian surveyors. The outcomes had been disappointing, with civilians in turn hiring their own unvetted assistants, resulting in a dip of standards. And it was a lesson that Thomas Colby would keep to heart when he was assessing the needs of the Irish survey. In Wellington's mind, the Irish venture would remain a military exercise, conducted by military staff with an output tailored to military, not civil needs. He had no intention of his highly skilled specialists differentiating boundaries of Irish baronies, parishes, or townlands. Townland data was, in fact, imperative for accurate tax reform, as these areas formed the foundation of cess assessments. Instead, others more familiar with Irish needs could later use generic ordnance mapping as a foundation for tax reform. By contrast, such bounds were part of the day-to-day working world of Ireland's civilian surveyors. While they could easily gather such information, their involvement had been warned against by Colby and explicitly blacklisted by Wellesley. Wellington fell in line with his brother's opinion, noting he positively refused to employ any surveyor in Ireland upon this service. Ireland thus could expect a product more suitable for resisting a French invasion than a reform of its taxes. And we can see here the image on the right. It's a map of townlands in North Ulster, and you can see the incredible dense network that they formed. And there was no official record of where all these were, and Wellington wished to steer well clear of them. The speed of Wellington's actions caught many parliamentarians off guard. Several had long called for tax reform and saw Wellington's actions as misguided. Chief among them were Irish MPs Thomas Spring Rice and Sir John Newport, who had long fought against the excessive corruption which pervaded the tax system. Over the previous years, both had investigated the relationship between civil divisions, taxation, and mapping, and had previously called for a new national survey to support their reformative goals. To their alarm, the likelihood of an unsuitable military-style survey was becoming more probable with each passing day. While the technical competence of Colby was not at issue, concerns about the ordnance's suitability remained. One was that the Ordnance Survey of Britain was in its third decade and still far from complete. A similar timeline for Ireland would be unacceptable given social tensions. The organisation's lack of experience in Ireland and the question of civil data also hung above Wellington's scheme. Paramount importance to reform and would be necessary in mapping. Colby, however, had no experience in this field, and civilian assistance would be needed for the inclusion of townlands. Civilians, however, remained persona non grata with Wellington. On the 10th of March, 1824, Spring Rice rose to speak in the House of Commons. His aim was to try and manoeuvre Wellington's plan back on course. He argued that as the needs of Ireland were so different from Britain's, that a select committee to explore the subject in greater detail should be formed. As Wellington would require parliamentary funding to execute the survey, he was forced to go along with proceedings. Years later, Spring Rice still felt that had the survey gone ahead as originally planned, then the gross injustice and grievous public discontent in Ireland would have continued. Within a few weeks, his new committee would begin hearing expert testimony on surveying, valuation, and the peculiarities of Irish land administration. The Parliamentary Select Committee for the Survey and Valuation of Ireland, also known as the Spring Rice Committee, consisted of 10 MPs. Most represented Irish constituencies and would, over several months, try to understand what Ireland needed regarding mapping for tax reform and if the Board of Ordnance could meet those demands. So, to give you a brief overview of what they were talking about, what were the main topics? The survey was conducted in 4 main parts, or it was planned to. First, you would have a triangulation that would act as a mathematical scaffold from which geographic data would be hung, and that everybody agreed pretty much would be due to follow to Colby and his team because they were used to it. They had the experience from Britain. And this was the eventual network that was set up for the primary triangulation, from the trig points they often find on the top of mountains. Second would be topographic detail, roads, houses, rivers, lakes, so forth. And the question remained, would the ordnance be able to conduct such detailed survey in a suitable time frame? And if they added civilian surveyors to their team, would that help improve the speed of which the survey can be conducted? So that was up in the air. Next, the hot topic was townland boundaries. There were no official records of it, so someone would have to find out where these townland boundaries are. Colby and Wellington wanted nothing to do with them because basically these acted as property boundaries as well, and they were not going to have military surveyors dragged into property disputes. So somebody had to figure out who's going to get this information. And then finally, this was the thing that impacted landholders, was if you can find where the townland boundaries are, if determine their acreages from mapping, and then value the soil quality on each one of these townlands, you come with a cash value for taxation. This would act as your record. Now, nobody wanted the Ordnance Survey involved in the valuation. They were to be kept entirely from it. And because all the mapping, all the triangulation, all the topographic detail had to be done first, the committee were pretty happy just to give valuation just a little lip service and leave it for someone else to talk about many years down the line. The expert witnesses called by the committee can be formed into several approximate groups. First were members of the Ordnance Survey, with Colby being most foremost. They would give the MPs their viewpoint on how the survey will be executed and focus on more technical elements, such as triangulation. Of equal prominence were several Irish engineers specifically invited to London. Their duty was to give the MPs their assessment of the project, advise on historical sources of information, comment on existing surveying capabilities, including their own, and provide updates on working conditions on the ground. The last group were a wider assemblage of witnesses from various professions. These included politicians, scientists, policemen, valuers, and a solitary land surveyor, each with their own input. Collectively, all groups would add to what the Irish survey would entail and how it would be best executed. For the most part, the committee maintained relatively open minds, though the looming figure of Wellington remained present, though off stage, throughout the investigation. The committee's initial weeks outlined the background of the tax issue and Colby's intentions. During their inaugural meeting, he informed them that he had chosen a scale of 6 inches to a mile for Ireland. This was mainly due to the change in scope needed for valuations, with this larger scale having been used by his department for its very first fortification maps. Colby readily admitted, however, that he had little familiarity with Ireland or its cartographic resources. He also underlined that he was determined to keep his officers as far from the realm of property as possible, not wanting them to be drawn into distracting boundary disputes, but he remained open to the inclusion of townlands or parish data if someone else identified them for him. By this stage, Colby's control of the triangulation network was virtually guaranteed, giving his teams experience in this field. The relation to the detail or territorial aspects of the survey, however, remained more opaque. Ordnance contributions to the valuation of land were also eliminated very early on. Colby continually reminded the committee of his general distrust of non-ordnance data. He wanted the Irish survey to be as scientifically accurate as possible and would only believe the information gathered by those under his supervision. With that, a clear line was drawn through Irish cartographic history, consigning earlier non-ordnance sources, such as the Down survey pictured here, to the past. And there's a bit of a mantra of Colby's in his biography related to the gathering of data, and it's never mind the testimony of anyone. Trust to your instrument. So it gives you a real insight into his thinking. The utility of historical sources was, by contrast, more frequently discussed with Irish engineers. A total of 5 were called for interview, being amongst the elite of their profession. They had all been involved with the impressive work of the Boggs Commission in the 1810s, and most completed separate county-level surveys within the last decade. Some would make several appearances before the committee and be asked semi-standardized questions to allow for comparative answers. Such planning was, however, vulnerable to change, with interviews often jumping from topic to topic with little logical structure. Regardless, the engineers were heard at length and genuinely with respect by the committee, the knowledge of Ireland being of obvious value. This deference was impressive given the criticisms they had received from Wellesley. However, if the issue of civil boundaries had not been necessary, it remains possible that the survey may have been entirely conducted without their advice. And one name here, Richard Griffith, has a little asterisk next to it. He would eventually become involved with the valuation and gathering of townland data. And many of you might have heard of Griffith's surveys, Griffith's valuations. So he was heavily involved with the committee. Just some of the examples of what they produced. This was a map of Roscommon in two parts. I think it's to 4 inches, 4 inches to a mile, by William Edgeworth and Richard Griffith, 1822. So it came out just before the committee sat. So this shows you the quality of mapping that was coming from Ireland's topographic engineers at that time. And we have another one here, again by William Edgeworth. Anyone who likes their 18th, 19th century history, he's the brother of Maria Edgeworth, the novelist. And this is a map of his home county of Longford. And you can see at the bottom the level of topographic detail included in these maps. This map comes in 4 parts, and at the top he also included a diagram of the triangulation network he used. So some county surveys use trig networks, others didn't, meaning they had various accuracies. Each engineer was also used to dealing with the Irish peasantry, as per the committee's terminology. Trouble, if encountered, usually occurred from suspicion, with acts of true resistance or vandalism coming from local grievances over boundaries or sheer boredom rather than organised opposition. Most engineers found that once they took the time to explain the purpose in the area, then distrust was replaced with curiosity, with one engineer informing the committee that he had never had the need to carry weapons for defence, and that he usually explained that his work was for the farmers' benefit. As such, they could advise on how to work in rural settings without attracting too much negative attention. This would be particularly useful to Colby, as he and his team will be new to Ireland's complex social makeup. The engineers were also able to add an international perspective by commenting on foreign mapping schemes conducted for taxation or those for scientific or of cartographic merit. These included the Napoleonic Cadastre of France, the United States Coastal Survey, and the primary triangulation of India. Of particular focus was the survey of Bavaria, which was done in such detail that individual house numbers were included in mapping. This information was indicative of the international networks Irish engineers maintained, and that the Irish survey was part of a wider, uncoordinated movement towards integrating taxation, governance, and science in this period. Colby, however, had a clear vision of what he intended and paid little heed to foreign surveys. This is one of the maps in particular.
I'm not sure what's happened here now. Finian, we can't hear you.
Apologies all. I think Finian's Wi-Fi may have dropped. If we just give it a minute or two just to see if it comes back.
It's interesting. I see there was a slide up there that showed a map prepared by Alexander Nemo. And Alexander Nemo was an engineer in Ireland for a long, long time, around that time. But there's a pier in Galway City known as Nemo's Pier, naturally called after the famous Alexander Nemo. He did a lot of work as well in Connemara on bridges and that type of thing.
Apologies all. If everyone just give it a minute or two until we try and get Finian back on the call.
Don't forget that you can post your questions and answers for when Finian comes back and when he's finished talking, and hopefully he'll be able to get to that at the end.
I think we should have Finian back on
You
the call
forgot
now.
me. Hello. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Very sorry.
What might be best, Finian, is maybe if you turn your camera off, that can put less pressure on your Wi-Fi, so might
Oh,
just avoid it happening again.
it's fine. We had a total network drop here. I'm hotspotting off my phone, but we'll consider that a pause for dramatic effect.
Yeah.
If I can get this up and running again. There we go. Can you see it? Yeah.
Looking good here, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I'm very sorry, everyone. Now, where was I? Irish resistance. Yes. As Irish surveying lacked an official figurehead or institution, the engineers' testimonies were given as individual voices rather than as a collective. Though differing on some technical methods, their evidence for the most part aligned. Some were obviously keen to be involved with the topographic element of the new project. All, however, agreed that Colby should have control of the triangulation and that ascertaining townland boundaries was below the specialist work of ordnance staff. Praise for Colby, however, was not universal. While the biggest names in Irish engineering could see that management of the survey was outside their reach, others protested. During the course of the committee's investigation, an article appeared in the Belfast newsletter complaining of the exclusion of a native surveyor in committee meetings, noting that we cannot conceive any just cause why men of acknowledged ability or honour should be thus neglected in the land of their nativity and be suffered to remain idle, if not mortified spectators of the operations of other men. This stance was mostly correct. Land surveyors, rather than their more qualified, though less numerous brethren, the engineers, had been mainly excluded from committee meetings. In fact, only one surveyor was called to testify before Spring Rice. Disappointingly, he had only been involved in one large estate survey in Ireland, having spent the majority of his career in England with its notably different work conditions. Others, however, could fill in blanks about the eccentricities in Irish land divisions. Most notable among them was Police Inspector Major George Warburton. He assured the committee, the MPs, that though townlands were usually missing in maps, they were well known on the ground. To illustrate this point, he regaled them with the tale of an attempted seizure of an illegal alcohol still. Once arrested, the offender argued his innocence as the still in question thrown over a fence and thus in another land outside of Warburton's jurisdiction. Surprisingly, this story did much to soothe the committee's anxieties. By early June, the committee had heard from over a dozen experts and retreated to compile their findings. Spring Rice remained acutely aware that while Colby had been willing in theory to include townlands in his mapping, Wellington's approval was still vital. As such, Spring Rice decided to approach the Duke in person. This was a gamble. However, it was wiser to resolve any differences in private than on the floor of the House of Commons. Recalling his visit many years later, Spring Rice related that he was kindly received by the Duke. Wellington began by explaining his issue with ordnance officers being asked to record features of a territorial nature rather than the natural geography of the country. Should their measurements differ from that of landowners, Wellington feared that his department would be dragged into the undesirable legal minefield of property disputes. Understandably, this was a realm soldiers were little fitted for. He also reminded Spring Rice of concerns over civilian surveyors and that his men could not take orders from them. To counter Wellington's argument, Spring Rice presented him with the committee's findings, especially the advantages civilians could bring in identifying townlands. Though the discussion was likely more heated than Spring Rice chose to recall, Wellington eventually relented, swayed by the weight of evidence supporting the inclusion of civil boundaries. The peculiar format of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland was thus set, with Colby removed from identifying townland boundaries, but required to record them once noted by others. The report for the Select Committee was presented to Parliament on the 21st of June, 1824. It was a summarisation of the information heard since March, recommending that the Board of Ordnance take charge of the Irish survey and that, unlike in Britain, it would note townland bounds. This was a significant victory for MPs who had challenged Wellington's decision to launch the survey, though Wellington's insistence on military management remained firmly in place. Throughout its pages, the report documented that the need for such a survey and the approximate methods to be employed. Importantly, it also noted the differences between this new venture and earlier government survey, stating all former surveys of Ireland originated in forfeitures and violent transfers of property. The present survey has for its object the relief of proprietors and occupiers of land from unequal taxation. Your committee trusts that the survey will be carried on with energy as well as with skill, and that it will, when completed, be credible to the nation and to the scientific acquirements of the present age. Irrespective of such goals, the project would remain a survey of Ireland rather than an Irish survey, at least initially, with little room for the island's resident engineers. As such, it was a reformative project within a wider system of imperialism. Despite its recommendations, the report also remained ambiguous enough to leave Colby sufficient room to conduct his work as he saw fit, though keeping within the report's course guidelines. His vision would soon become an indelible part of Ireland's cartographic heritage, this new theatre being as much of a departure for his organisation as it was for its subject. Colby received his orders to deploy to Ireland the day after the Spring Rice Report was published. The peculiar survey had begun. Thank you.
Well done. And a huge amount of research must have gone into this, Finian. I think everybody will agree. There's
Yeah,
there's a Rania.
Oh, it's about 2 years on this particular subject alone. About 2 years ago, I started seeing that the dates were aligning for the bicentenary, and I thought this would be wonderful to have something for this. Even a paper, and papers with me have a tendency to grow out of proportion. So we got it to book size, and I'm very happy with that.
There is a quote from the same David McCullough that says when he's writing his books, there's an awful temptation to just keep researching. There comes a point when you have to stop and start writing. I'm sure you met that.
Absolutely, absolutely. You want to see how big the story could go, and with this particular project, it was different than a lot of my other research, because usually you don't have a lot of background information. You just might have map series or something. But with this, you had volumes and volumes of background information. So the emphasis switched from trying to piece together fragmentary data to actually refining what we had and culling large chunks to keep a narrative and to say what is most important, because the committee meeting records they're incredibly detailed, but also a bit of a nightmare to work through.
Yeah. And we have a question, and thank you for the sending in the question. And if anybody else has questions, just pop them in there on the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. This question says, the ancient historical surveys seem to be very interesting. How did this affect the economy at the time? So in other words, did the production of the maps then prove to be beneficial at the end of the day?
It was beneficial for the nation, for the island of Ireland, because firstly, it worked towards the equalisation of taxation. That's great. And with the publication of the maps from the mid-1830s onwards, you had far greater access to high quality map data, and that was great because that's about the time that the railways were coming in as well. So the railways and the Ordnance Survey found the Ordnance Survey to be incredibly supportive of that. For the surveying community, it was a disruptor to the industry. You now no longer had to go employ a surveyor if you wanted a map of a particular property or an area or a county. You could actually just purchase that yourself. And really who it impacted were a lot of the engineers that were interviewed by the committee, because many of them had specialized in county or provincial level surveys. And then they found that this market had actually was about to become dominated by the OS. So they switched to more specialized engineering roles. Some working abroad as well, but it had that disruptive element on that elite within the profession. But for just your ordinary day-to-day land surveyor, they found that they could also advertise that they could work with ordnance mapping and extract areas from ordnance mapping, which an ordinary person or their clients mightn't be able to do. So when we talk about particularly the first edition OS maps, it's a bit of a Monty Python arguments like, what have the Romans ever done for us? It was good, but again, within that imperialist system as well. It was reform, imperialism, disruptive to some elements, but supportive of others.
And you know, Finian, that nowadays all of these government contracts seem to run way over budget. I presume that the Ordnance Survey had something similar in its day as well, because the carte blanche that seemed to have been given to Colby to run it whatever way he wanted, I think a lot of things seem to have been added in there that maybe wasn't originally envisaged.
Yeah, and a lot of that is down to Colby himself. The budget was £300,000, which I think is about 15 million euro. And Colby, as many of you know, it didn't just turn into a survey, a series of maps. It became like investigations into the history and culture, and it really became this gigantic scientific machine. He employed linguists, he employed historians, he employed, landscape artists. So he really sort of developed a menagerie of specialists. And money was always an issue. Colby often went without his own pay, so he could direct that money to help support his work, and that backfired on him because he wasn't paid paid it back in the end. The army wouldn't recognize that he had made that sacrifice, so he had to do without. And he was eventually just told, look, rein in your scientific curiosity, get the maps out. What you're doing is of use. But even many people might have heard the work of John O'Donovan, the Irish linguist, and his work in identifying his townland names. It's the sort of the subject of translations, which is not a historically correct play, but it's beautiful, and it tells a wider story than just the OS. And you may also know Creedon's Atlas of Ireland, which I think is still on RTE, which talks about name books and things like that produced by the OS at that time.
Okay, yeah. I couldn't imagine any of the people involved in the things like the Children's Hospital going without pay. There you go. There's
The
another
times have
question here.
changed.
How did the local people react to the mapping? Because that was something that always intrigued me when I worked with the Ordnance Surveyors. Were they in danger? Now they were military, of course. So maybe it had some protection there. But there was rumors that a few actually were killed on the job. But
It,
maybe you could know more about that.
the military aspect is big. Colby had 3 companies of men by 1827, so we're just talking about 250 men thereabouts. There were no real civilians employed at that stage. There were a mixture of Royal Engineers and sappers. Sappers were mainly the enlisted men who did most of the chain work and the hard graft. They did have Irish labourers working with them, but nothing like no technical roles. They did not carry weapons in the field during the early years. They were uniformed, but they didn't carry weapons because they wanted to dispel that. Several of the engineers used to working in Ireland had said that even when they were at work, social tensions were very high in those days. Catholic emancipation was a big deal. 1798 had only been a couple of decades before. There was war in Europe throughout the 1810s. So localized war was still, it's quite alien to us, thank goodness here, but at that time it wasn't. So even the engineers, when they worked in an area, sometimes the locals would get up in arms thinking there was going to be a war, that the army's going to come in and fortify the hills. And they had to reassure them, no, look, we're just here to put in a pier or build a bridge, that's all. But Colby, they were pretty strict on not having ordnance staff armed. Colby got in trouble once in the north when he gave some of his staff, or reassigned some of his staff to help put down a localized riot. And he was given out to that by the Board of Ordnance, saying, "You're not there for that. We have to keep the OS away from enforcement here. That's not what they're for." But that did have an impact on morale as well. These men were soldiers. Some wanted to be armed just because they were soldiers, particularly officers. But for the most part, OS didn't carry weapons. There were so many local issues as well. And I think the audience here can have their own experiences with that. Sometimes you walk into the middle of a dispute between 2 property owners. It's not your fault, but you're there in a technical capacity, and you can be blamed by one side or the other. And there's also that curiosity that surveyors bring. I think for land surveyors, everybody has been asked to take somebody's photo with a total station at least once in your career. So mixtures, but they were working in a very tense social time. So violence, localized riots were common.
Yeah, yeah. And don't forget that it wasn't even too long after the rebellion of 1798 and the
Yeah,
other rebellion of 1803. So we were kind of in that same era.
yeah.
Another question here for you. How long did it take to complete the primary triangulation, and did Major Colby also have responsibility for the topographic survey as well as the primary triangulation? Did it go into both fields?
Yeah, so Colby, this is where Colby and Wellington were really in step with each other. So the primary triangulation, I think, because I tend to focus on the pre-ordnance here in my own research. I think it took about 5 years, but it took at least 2 years to measure the Lockfoyle baseline to perfect accuracy, and the first maps were then produced in 1833. They began the topographic element before the primary network was completed, just because it was taking longer than they thought. So the topographic, they were originally just going to complete the triangulation first and then start into the topography, but they overlapped. And then Colby was in charge, but Colby was just in charge of anything within his site that he could be. He's a very eccentric man, but he was also a micromanager. So while he was in Mountjoy House, he was in London at the HQ of the Board of Ordnance in the Tower of London. He was also on top of mountaintops with his men. And there was seasonal work for a lot of that because they were weather dependent, particularly when doing the triangulation. But Wellington had huge faith in him. Wellington interfered in everybody's life under his command, and he was so secretive that I know even before the Battle of Waterloo, he wouldn't even share his plans with his direct general staff for the following day. But with Colby, he just let him run. Even when he was petitioned to get certain young officers' roles within the Ordnance Survey, Wellington he just answered back saying, "This is Colby's baby. You have to talk to him about it. I won't interfere in his work, and I won't tell him what to do because he's my expert."
Very good. Then another final question, I'd say this time now, because we're beginning to come to that stage now. Did anyone at the time dispute townland names, or were they taken as what they were told? And I presume that could be extended and say that were there disputes about, say, townland boundaries as well, in local areas that you know of?
Well, the naming thing is quite topical, I guess, because of translations, Brian Friel's play. Where the disputes came from townland names, yes, it was through interview. That's actually how they got a lot of townland names and townland boundaries. Richard Griffith's team would go out in the field, talk to people, ascertain where they were. Now, there was also pushback from the Ordnance Survey when they went to measure these marks that Griffith's team had put out, and they often said he knows nothing about these townland bounds. We're getting local people are telling us it's all wrong. So where's the problem here? And Colby and Griffith would often butt heads over that. That they just weren't happy with each other's work, and Colby was a perfectionist. But naming was a real issue for Colby. He had spent a lot of time in Wales as a child, so he was used to a bilingual environment. And in Wales, the OS of Britain had been just lambasted for some of the mistakes they've made in local Welsh names and trying to anglicize them, as what happened in some parts of Ireland as well, whereas it was the Irish version. So he was willing to invest a lot in people like John O'Donovan, linguists, to get to what should we call this and how can we best translate this to an English sounding thing, but still remain true to the Irish original. And on the topic of townlands, we must remember that in some areas, the work of the OS in translations was huge. But in other areas, you had about 500 years of English administrators butchering Irish local names. So they were using those already pre-Anglicized um, versions and inserting them into mapping. So it was a bit of it became its own sort of sub-department within the OS, and a very important one culturally here. And we are seeing the reversion of some of them. I know in places like Kerry, where like on Dangan and stuff, where the localized names are used. And it's nice that it's there, that it's still there. But one of the more controversial, but also complex and it's sort of grayish areas of the OS work, but again, very important for its mission, and that was to help reevaluate CES and tides.
Very good. I'm afraid we're not able to take any more questions there. There's one or two popped in there there a minute ago, but we won't be able to take any more now. We're running to that stage now where we have to close off. But I'd like to thank you, especially Finian, for a very enlightening presentation. I look forward to the book, and I'm sure a lot of others will as well. And it'll take its place in my library with pride, up along with the other surveying books that I have. And I'll be glad to see it when it comes out and look forward to getting it. I also want to thank Grace O'Doherty, who has been in the background working tirelessly here while this event was going on. And Grace, you were very good, and thank you for all your great work there. So I want to thank everybody for attending, and happy Saint, I was going to say Saint Surveyors Day, but it's just Global Surveyors Day. So happy Global Surveyors Day to you all. And hopefully next year we'll have something similar. And thank you, and thanks for joining our CPD. So I'm going to have one final quote just as I'm closing off here by Henry David Thoreau. It says, "Books are the carriers of civilization. Without books, history is silent." And I think that Finian would agree with that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everybody, and looking forward to meeting you all again at some stage.